welcome everybody. So I'm Paul Hannam. I'm one of the two chair people of Greening Stenning. For those of you who don't know us, we're based in Sussex. We're a small town, but we've actually got over 1,000 supporters in our group, and we've grown, well, quite dramatically over the lockdown period. And we've got a lot of very exciting things going on, and we'll be putting some information in the chat. So we've just set up a repair cafe, for example. We had our second one a couple of weeks ago and had over 100 people come. And we have a lot of people who don't normally come to green events, and that was a great success. And our next one is on October the 23rd on Saturday afternoon, which is at Beeding and Bramber Village Hall. On October the 27th, we've got a social event, which is something that happened pre-pandemic, and you might recall, where people come together in a hall. And this one, we're going to be having an evening of Syrian food and a chance to meet people in Green Stenning, make new friends. So very much a social evening. If you can find out more details on our website. And if you sign up for our newsletter, you'll get information on all of these events. But our main work tonight is to talk with Henry Mance about his wonderful book, How to Love Animals in a Human-Shaped World, which I read a couple of weeks ago and thought was quite brilliant, actually. One of the best books I've read in the last year or so. And just to give you a background about Henry, he's really been exploring his relationship and our relationship with animals to find out what it would take, not just to think like animal lovers, but to act like animal lovers. And I think at the heart of his writing and this conversation will be this dissonance, this contrast between our feelings and our thoughts about animals and how we actually behave. Henry is an award-winning journalist at the Financial Times. And a few years ago, after the birth of his daughters, he set out to really rethink his impact on the natural world. His new book really explores the reality of farming, zoos, hunting, conservation, pets, and more. And it asks how we could change our society so that it works for elephants, cows, whales, and bees, the full range. So his journey has moments of humour, sadness, and amazement. It's a book I thoroughly recommend. I believe our friends at Stenning Bookstore are offering a 15% discount. And so I encourage you to do that. But on that note, I perhaps ask you just to open your video, because I know Henry will want to ask a question to everyone. Henry, welcome. Perhaps you could start by telling us your big idea about the book and a bit more about it.
Oh, thanks a lot. Thanks for having me. It's really nice to speak. And obviously, sorry not to be there in person, but as I can't be in North Carolina in person, I guess this is a pretty efficient way. And I'm only afraid that you've caught me after a day of doing DIY, which I have to say, working in an abattoir, which I did for the book, prepares you for some things. And like for me, DIY is almost as bad as working in an abattoir. So I'm glad that the book has left that inspirational legacy. I guess I always imagined, Paul, in answer to your question, that there was like an ethos in the way that you could have an ethos for dealing with other people, or an ethos for how much you were going to give to charity, that there would be like some way that you could devise in your head for living with other animals, like just an ethic, a sort of, something you could write on a piece of card and put in your wallet or something like that. And because that's not taught at school, or indeed I think in church or wherever else you might go for inspiration, I wondered if I could devise one myself. And of course, it's more complicated than that. And people will take their own preferences and decisions. But I at least found the experience of going around and asking the questions allowed me to come to a conclusion about what I thought I wanted my relationship to be with animals, and what lessons I wanted to pass on to my kids. And then I think other people can hopefully take bits of the book and run with them and arrive at different conclusions. And I think that's fine. But the really big problem is that people don't even do the first steps of action. That we all call ourselves animal lovers, and I managed to spend a bit of time on YouTube just going through and finding clips of people saying how much they loved animals, and I just I had great fun with that. But I feel it's like a theoretical love, and I say in the book it's like my love for art house cinema, which like in theory I really like highbrow cinema and I go to the art house cinema all the time, but in practice I spend years not going there. So, I feel like people, when they call themselves animal lovers, how much are they actually doing to make animals' lives better? And that's part of the idea of the book.
Sorry, yeah.
No, you go.
No, were you gonna ask a question to the audience?
Yeah. So should I kick off with my bit?
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
Yeah. So I wanted to, I guess, unlike most groups I speak to, I guess everybody is worried about climate change. I suppose if you just wave your hands if you're worried about climate change. Yeah, I do speak to audiences where nobody is worried about it. So that's reassuring. And who's trying to cut down on how much meat they eat? Great. So nearly all of you. And who is actually gone vegetarian or vegan? Great. Okay. A couple. Brilliant. Well, I would take this as a very sophisticated audience in that case. I really hope that by the time we've spoken tonight and I heard your questions and talked, I obviously want people to eat less meat and eat less dairy, but I also feel like it's a partly that any step is very welcome, and just having that conversation. I want to talk a bit later about individual action, how much it means and how we can change opinions. And it's not by being perfect or being dogmatic about things, but more about living, I think, a good example of what is a life with a low environmental impact. So yeah, great to see your experiences, and yeah, feel free to turn your cameras off and I know the privacy of Zoom is a great luxury. I say a few things about why I wrote the book, which is that books are enormously important to our the way we treat animals. I mean, one of the biggest problems we have is that people don't think about animals. So there are no pigs or chickens or cows running through the streets of London, or indeed horses. I mean, horses completely revolutionized our attitude to animals when we saw them suffering, carrying burdens in the early 19th century. But we don't have those working animals right in front of us in cities or towns now. And in some ways that makes it easy for us to forget about animals and forget about our impact on them. And we can turn on Attenborough and see the wild animals that we love. And so I think books are enormously important about getting us to reflect. And I turned vegetarian after reading Sapiens by Yuval Noah Hariri. And when I was researching this book, I was amazed at how many people have been influenced by Peter Singer's book, Animal Liberation, and indeed other works on this. And that I think the act of sitting down and thinking about these issues for a little while can force you to make changes that you didn't think you were particularly attached to. And I always imagined writing a book about environmental policy. That's something I was very passionate about and am very passionate about. But I feel that people have a deep love for their pets. I mean, we spend several billion pounds a year as a nation on our pets. And that represents something really powerful. And I wanted to play into that love for animals that people feel. And, I had a dog as a child, and I don't name my dog in the book because I still use his name as my internet passwords. And I went to the zoo and saw pandas at London Zoo, and I thought they were the most amazing animals. And this book has allowed me to sort of go back through all those experiences. But it was particularly some moments in my late 20s and early 30s when, at that stage you slightly fall out of contact with animals. You maybe not in a situation where you have a pet. You're not being taken to the zoo by your parents. As possessive as my parents can be, they'd stop taking me to the zoo in my late 20s. And it all came back in a sudden when I had kids, that I found myself surrounded by images and representations of animals in cartoons, in storybooks, and indeed as their teddies. And I thought, I am teaching my children something about animals. I'm teaching them that animals are important, that animals are beings that we should love, that animals are beings that speak and have emotions in these books and in these cartoons. But I know not that it wasn't so much that these stories were false. And I always think of the tiger who came to tea, which is obviously everyone takes as a metaphor, whereas I think it's an entirely literal story about a tiger. What would happen if a tiger came for tea? But if you're going to be pedantic about it, the first thing the tiger would eat is the little girl. So that didn't bother me so much, but it did bother me that I was teaching my daughter that tigers were beautiful, important beings, that they were part of our world, and yet I knew that the space for them has been shrinking. Although, luckily, in the case of tigers, over the last few years, there is better news thanks to protections, particularly in India. So my kids made me rethink this, and they made me rethink what would be an ethos. And actually, at the beginning of the pandemic, I really thought there was a moment where people would have a similar realization to what I did, which is that we need to reshape our entire sort of way of living towards the and attitudes to the natural world. And some of you might remember those stressful, painful, surreal days at the start of the pandemic where life shut down, where there were reports of wild animals, sort of large mammals roaming the streets of cities around the world, where people went for walks in their local forests and woodlands in a way that they just hadn't before, and they started appreciating nature. And then obviously millions of people adopted pets, and because deprived of human company, we looked to the animal world. And I really felt that this disease, which had crossed to us from animals, that had shown our dependence on the natural world, would make us rethink. I'm not so optimistic now, but I still think that there isn't an open door to push on when it comes to our relationship with animals. So what did I learn doing this book? Well, the book starts with a history of our relationship with animals and sort of how we've gone from living side by side with them, perhaps in fear of them, worried that they were going to eat us, and how we've then come up with various ideas, particularly in the West, about our dominance over other animals, and why we were particularly different, and the idea that a cow was specifically designed by God so that we could eat it, which of course, looking at it through Darwin's lens now is obviously slightly ridiculous, but it made sense at that point to have a hierarchy. And I love the idea that at a certain point in the early modern period, it was taboo to dress up as an animal because it crossed the line. The idea that we were separate as animals was so inviolable that to dress up as an animal was to cross that and was to do something very wrong. And over time, that's been chipped away at. And I particularly liked what the primate expert Frans de Waal, who's done a lot of research into animal cognition, told me, which is that the risk is not anthropomorphizing animals. The risk is not anthropomorphizing them. That if we can see a state of or type of behavior or a type of emotion being practiced by an animal, that our starting point should probably be to assume that they are expressing the emotion we think they are, and that they are capable of that. And if it's proved over time that they don't have that ability, and there are particular questions, for example, over memory of events and to what extent other animals talk about past events in the way that they'll communicate about past events in the way that we do. There are questions over language, but if that's shown, that's fine. But we can assume that they feel some of the emotional connections. And the story of the orca who carried her dead calf for over 1,000 miles for 17 days, and bringing home probably the potential of orcas to feel grief, I think was very powerful as an illustration of that. I learned lots about the environmental impact of meat and dairy, and I think it's so strong that when I'm gonna reel off a couple of statistics just because I think there are some issues on which it's a matter of 1 or 2%. I was a journalist and I read about Brexit, and there were sort of various estimates coming out about what leaving the single market would do, and it was fairly horrific, but it was still a couple of percentage points of GDP here or there. With the environmental impact of animal products compared to non-animal products, you're really talking often an order of magnitude, but several times really the impact in cases. So we're recommended by the NHS to eat 50 grams of protein a day. Now, globally, if you need to, using the global average here, if you want to produce that using beef, you need 80 square meters of land. So that's 80 square meters to get your daily allowance of beef. If you want cheese, you go down to 20 meters squared. So you're doing a big improvement. Pigs, 5 meters squared. So again, a big improvement. Chicken, 3.5 meters squared. Peas, less than 2 meters squared. And tofu, from soybeans, obviously, a meter squared. So you've come down from 80 for beef to 1 meter for soybeans. And obviously, it's much more efficient just to eat the soybeans rather than to feed them to cows, to give cows all the energy they need to live and to walk around and to heat themselves, and then to eat that meat. I think people thinking about what we eat, they're very worried about protein. Always is a question I get, but we eat more protein than we need, and the health benefits of eating less of it and eating less red meat in particular are clear. I learned lots of things about animal welfare, things that I hadn't expected to learn, and I came late to animal welfare issues, and I never really thought about it as a child. So I'm very sympathetic to people who eat meat all their lives. I ate meat most of my life, and I was a vegetarian when I started this book. My wife said, if you go vegan, it's divorceable. And I'm delighted to say that we are still married, and she is downstairs. But part of the reason that I think we were able to stay together, despite this, is because we both agree that what happens on farms is very tough. I mean, I worked at a pig breeding farm as research for this book, where a sow would typically be impregnated at 6 months and then culled after 6 litters at the age of 3. So her piglets would be killed at 5 or 6 months. And it was sort of translating that into a human life and what that would mean. That would mean us being killed before our 5th birthday. And I started to see these lives which weren't full of fulfillment, which weren't full of choices, ending very quickly. I spoke to a dairy farmer who told me that when he grew up, a cow might last for 8 or 10 lactations, whereas now she would be lucky to see 3 because of the strain put on her body. I mean, it's absolutely incredible that in the US, a dairy cow gives 30 liters of milk a day on average, which has increased 30% over the last 2 decades. There's just been a huge increase in the strain that we put on dairy cows and indeed on chickens who grow too fast for their own skeletons, sadly. And I'm always impressed by the statistic that if you were a bird born on planet Earth at random, you would probably be a chicken, a domesticated chicken. And that doesn't really seem to sum up the love we have for all these different types of birds. I was lucky enough to live in Colombia, where they have hummingbirds, and indeed more bird species than any country in the world in Colombia. But and we love all of these birds. We leave food out for them, and yet the one bird that we produce more of than any other is the domestic chicken. There are some controversial things, I think, in the book. First, the book tries to unify both conservation and animal welfare, and there's often a contradiction in these two things between conservationists who really care about ecosystems, often about endangered species, but you can link a lot of what they do back directly to creating a planet which is good for humans. Animal rights and animal liberation activists are interested in the particular feelings of animals. So they're not thinking about human benefit directly. They're thinking about human well-being. About animal well-being. And so these things can come into conflict. And I think if you need to manage an ecosystem by culling a particular species, such as deer in Scotland, over 100,000 of whom a year are killed because there are no natural predators, then these come into conflict. And there's an argument between animal rights activists and conservationists. Conservationists say we've got to kill deer so that the forests grow back. Whereas what I fundamentally feel is that the food system is the thing that joins those two groups, that both animal rights activists who are worried about what happens on farms to the welfare of individual animals, and conservationists who are worried about greenhouse gas emissions and the the disappearing of grasslands and forests around the world, that they can unify on this one thing, which is that we have to eat less meat and dairy. However, there are trade-offs, and I mentioned deer culling, and I wanted to explore that. And I decided that for me, hunting and killing animals where it has an environmental purpose and where it raises money for the protection of wild spaces can indeed be defensible, and it can be part of an ethic of loving animals. I want to. I think my time is actually nearly up. Before I want to say one bit about this book is very much about what you can do. And it's partly because I conceived it as a book written to my children about how we live and why we just decided to take these decisions as a family. Sometimes people say to me, they say, how can you bring your kids up vegetarian? How can you take that choice for you? And I've borrowed an idea from someone else, which is that the response to that is to say, well, would you let your children eat the family pet? And if they say no, well, then you've taken that decision for them. So we all have an ethic about what animals are okay to eat and what aren't okay to eat. And we all take choices for our children. And I'm very comfortable in the ones I've taken. But there are limitations to what individual action can do. Obviously, me giving up meat and me now giving up dairy. And even if I fed that same diet to my children all the time, how would that change the world? And I think I want to argue that individual change does matter, that changing your behavior, that taking a stand, that being a pioneer, it does matter. And firstly, I would say that individual change, it spreads. So I'm vegan now, and when I have friends around for dinner and we've got friends coming at the weekend, I'll cook vegan food. And I think that introduces them to that, and the message spreads. I think there are some behaviors which are simply social. You know, we buy new presents for each other at our birthdays. And I think if you say, look, I don't really want you to buy me a new present. I don't need a new thing. I just it'd be nice to see you. Or we could go for a walk sometime or whatever, to move away from this constant consumerism. I think that spreads. I think saying to people, I'm not going to fly on holiday because I'm worried about the emissions, I think, again, that spreads, and that gives people the license, that hope is infectious in this way. What I really think is that it's very difficult for politicians to act right now, that often politicians only act when people have effectively taken the decisions for them. You may remember a couple of years ago, England and Scotland and Wales, and I think Northern Ireland as well, banned the use of wild animals in circuses. This seemed like a real step forward for animal welfare. The truth is that Scotland, which was the first of the countries in the UK to ban the use of wild animals in circuses, didn't have any wild animals in circuses because people had stopped going to watch wild animals in circuses. They wouldn't want to see that anymore. I think when England banned it in 2019, there were 19 wild animals in circuses, including 6 reindeers and 4 camels. So often, the ban only comes, or the action only comes, once people have taken the decision. And you could look at it the same in fur sales or foie gras. And I think even on cases where it's more controversial, where you do need political action, that political action relies on a certain number of people opting out. So the smoking ban in England came into force, I think, or was passed in 2005, 2007 in England. The statistics around that was that about a quarter of people smoked, which was down from nearly half in the sort of in the 70s. And the fact that most people didn't smoke gave politicians a license to act on this, that it wasn't going to be everyone who was going to be shut out of the pub. It was going to be a minority of people. The problem we have with meat is that 95% of people do eat meat in Britain and eat it regularly, and they don't want to be taxed or made to feel bad about it. And so I'm looking to sort of build up a group of, build that 5% of vegans and vegetarians up to 25 or 30% of people. And I think that will empower politicians to start changing the subsidies, to changing the availability of meat, and with a huge environmental benefit that will use less land and have fewer emissions. I also believe that individuals, if they convert their behavior, they can often spread it in the workplace. And so the best vegan burgers available are, I think, made by Impossible Foods and Beyond Meat, which are 2 California companies. Beyond Burgers are available in the UK. And those companies are not aiming at vegetarians or vegans. They're aiming at meat eaters, but they're run and founded by vegans, people who use their commitment to a particular cause, both and then they funneled that into their work life. And I think lots of us have opportunities to do that. I think it's not a trade-off between individual action and between political action. It's an emergency. And the people I met who were most committed to individual action, to making sure their lives lived up to their principles, were in fact Extinction Rebellion activists who really wanted political change, but they believed it started with them too. So I'm going to leave, I think I've probably used up my time, so I'm going to leave you with a quote by Henry Thoreau, which I quite like, which was when he was wondering what to do. And he wrote in his journal, do the things which lie nearest to you, but which are difficult to do. And I think that's quite a good message, that we don't need to give up our jobs or sort of move to the Amazon, and that would be very difficult and probably we'd be quite miserable and counterproductive, and would involve lots of sacrifices. But there are things that lie close to us which we can do, which would make a huge difference. And I know that an organization or people joining in a group like this will have exactly that experience, and the repair workshop sounds absolutely perfect in that sense. But I think, just eating a little bit less meat and just offering other people the opportunity to. And one of the things I say is that in terms of how one should give up or eat less meat, but my fourth step, and we can come on to the others at another time, but my fourth step is don't feel bad about it. Don't feel bad if you end up eating sausages one day because you just have a craving, but also don't feel bad about requesting it. When you go around to someone's house or you go to a restaurant, people are very willing to make the effort. And I feel now that the changing in this way is really pushing on an open door. So thank you so much for listening. And I'd be delighted to hear any questions and thoughts and experiences of relationships with animals and indeed changing them.
Brilliant. Thank you ever so much. So I actually had my Beyond Meat burger last night. If you haven't ever had them, they are amazing. I mean, they really are very, very good quality, but not here to endorse any product though.
Yeah.
Henry, you talked about the footprint of the different, comparing beef and the carbon footprint and the area you need. What other really surprising or shocking statistics or facts or information did you discover when you were writing this book you think people should really know about?
Paul, you may remember this from the book, but do you know how many pheasants and partridges are released in the Britain every year?
No, remind me. I forgot that one.
Well, take a guess then.
Oh gosh. I had 2 drop dead in my garden over the last month by total coincidence, but I would say 100,000. I don't know.
The estimates, and there's no precise figure, is somewhere north of 40 million a year.
Oh, wow.
But just before shooting season starts, half of the biomass of wild birds in this country are partridges and pheasants, so that's basically 1 per person in Britain is released, even though most people obviously have no interest in shooting them. And they're bred in cages, so it's terrible for welfare. They obviously play they're obviously part of the environment in terms of when some of them die, they're eaten, etc. They play a role. But this is not for me ethical hunting, releasing millions of birds that have been captive bred. I think you can make a case that a deer lives a better life than a cow. And I was really surprised actually speaking to people who said a dairy cow lives a worse life than a beef cow, which really upends your idea about vegetarianism. But I think but ethical hunting is about wild animals and protecting wild spaces, not breeding millions of animals in cages, releasing them and then shooting them like that. Other statistics around that, look, coral reefs. I mean, there was some news out this week about coral reefs, but I think people have not got their head around the fact that this century we could lose all coral reefs. And for anyone, and I've had the privilege to dive and to snorkel on coral reefs, and I write about briefly about that in the book. But they are the most amazing places. I think they are more amazing than the Amazon or more amazing than the Serengeti. I mean, the richness of a coral reef and the colors and just the extraordinary array of things. And obviously underwater you can't hear so well, so you'll just be approached from behind by a turtle or something. I mean, it's absolutely astonishing. And we lose all that. And I think, you know, there are statistics about sort of at what degree we lose most of them. I mean, is it 1.5 or is it 2%? But, you know, I think that is stunning. And it's often these questions which are so obvious, but it's just hard for people to process. I think people are used to statistics which might be wrong. And I think for me, the hardest thing is the very clear statistics, such as the ones that say meat is incredibly inefficient, or that coral reefs are in lots of trouble, or that the Amazon may well die back after a certain point. And it's actually just processing those and saying these aren't close to a point where they're wrong. You know, the message is very, very clear.
No, absolutely. In your work and research, have you come across what you see as best practices, or maybe communities or nationalities that have got it right, you know, that are offering an alternative vision for how we could treat animals?
I think I'm probably not one of these people who says, for example, that India has it all right, because there are real questions about buffalo and leather, and so you know, people look for a kind of, does Buddhism offer the way out? I spoke to I spoke to a Mongolian Buddhist who was over here, and I said, well, how do you reconcile your sort of ethic of non-violence towards animals with the fact you live in a country which is very inhospitable to crop farming? So nearly all of Mongolia is effectively grazing lands, and people rely on eating camels and other livestock. I said, well, how do you reconcile these two things? And he said, well, if the killing is out of sight, then maybe it's less of a sin. And I have to say that I wasn't entirely convinced by this ethic, or indeed, and you know, India has lots of issues, even though 30% of the population are vegetarians. So I don't really think about it in those terms. I think in many ways, if I were to pick one, I guess the indigenous cultures of the Amazon, or indigenous communities of the Amazon, who have a real sense of connectedness with the environment and a sense of not trying to over exploit, who don't domesticate and breed animals to the extent we do, but who, where necessary, will kill animals, I think probably are as close as anyone will hunt wild animals and try and kill them painlessly. But even there, the anthropologists I spoke to said that, you know, there can be real animal cruelty, even though in these cultures and in these belief systems, there is a continuity, much more of a continuity between humans and other animals. So they have the idea that perhaps a human can transform into a jaguar, but they'll be very happy inflicting suffering on a jaguar nonetheless. So I don't think there's perfection anywhere. And I was actually quite heartened doing the research and the history that Britain has been a place of enormous innovation since the end of the 18th century, really. And, you know, the RSPCA, which was founded here, was replicated in the US, or copied in the US and elsewhere. The RSPB, which you mentioned, I think actually we outlawed the use of feathers in women's hats probably slightly after the United States there. But, you know, the 1970s, where Peter Singer and animal liberation came along, I think that this has been a country which has been very forward thinking. And I look at the surveys on climate change, and I'm, you know, delighted to see that British people take it seriously in a way that sadly Americans and Australians are still divided on.
Absolutely. Well, we've actually had a lot of questions come in, so I'm going to move straight to the chat now. We have a question from Dotties. Wouldn't cows be hurting if we didn't eat and use dairy? What would be the impact of ending the dairy industry?
Look, I think we would have none of the animals who are alive today on farms are going to be alive in 15 years. So it's not a case that we're you know, what I want from the livestock industry to get smaller is just not to replace those animals. It's going to be a slow wind down, and I think it's sort of cutting out the stage of artificial insemination, of regular pregnancies. I mean, unfortunately, dairy cows live very stressed lives, which includes being impregnated and then being separated immediately from their calves, who are sometimes killed but taken away to be raised as meat, which I think is quite a distressing situation for animals. And I think that what my vision is a world in which animals have the freedom to take decisions over their own lives. And that is very difficult to do on farms. It's particularly difficult to do on industrial dairy farms where cows don't even go outside. I think we just have, even if one is, I think, more positive than I am about farms, there is a real imbalance. The livestock, I think I'm right in saying that the livestock on planet Earth weighs 10 times as much as all the other wild birds and mammals. And that's a huge amount.
You're right. Funny enough, this came up on Saturday, Henry. It's actually 96% of the weight of all animal mass is humans and livestock. It's quite extraordinary. Yeah, it's increasing every year. Yeah.
So when we think about the animals that bring richness to our lives, I just think that's the wrong way around. And we have to accept that our cows eating soya are squeezing the Amazon. And so there is a trade-off there.
No, absolutely. So here we've got a question. Do you think that the recent crisis of worker shortages in abattoirs and the culling of animals might change attitudes? Could this trigger a change, do you think?
It's fascinating. And like, why? So in the book, I worked briefly in an abattoir. And but I think more relevant than that is an experience I had with a US researcher who'd worked out a way of gene editing cows so that they didn't have horns, polled, and there are welfare benefits of that the horns can be problematic in farms, so removing them is potentially a welfare benefit. But later on in her research, she'd been told that by the Food and Drug Administration in the US, the regulator, that she would have to apply for approval of these animals as a drug. So they weren't to be treated like other cattle. They were considered a drug. And so she couldn't. She had these cows in her sort of university in California, but she couldn't sell them for meat. And so she had to cut up and kill and cut up and incinerate her cow without being able to make use of that meat. And she was someone who was absolutely relaxed about the meat industry. Absolutely relaxed about eating beef, but very, very upset about an animal life going to waste in that way. And it was interesting for me because I think we tell ourselves that meat is necessary, and that's how we get by with it. That's how we get by with the sheds full of animals that are in our countryside. But when it becomes clear to us that it isn't necessary, then the whole artifice falls down. And I think that's a bit what's happening with our worker shortage when we see pigs being culled. We're upset for the same reason that researcher in California, Alison Van Eenenen, was upset, which is that you want to see it as necessary. And when these pigs have lived lives which are senseless, which have no purpose and no onward use, then I think we can't stomach that. And I think if we were to ask that question about the whole meat industry, then we would come to the same conclusion. I think it's possible it has an impact. I think what I'm more optimistic about is supermarkets putting in vegan and vegetarian food, young people drinking oat milk, and indeed middle-aged and old people also drinking oat milk, but the money going into creating alternatives to meat. So I think I probably learnt my lesson from the beginning of the pandemic, that to expect people to change their views overnight because of something in the news is too optimistic.
Next question is, I think, one that's appropriate for many of us. So what are your thoughts on the carbon footprint of pets, particularly dogs and cats?
So I talk about pets in the book, and indeed I can see the Dalmatian behind you actually. In the book cover. So yeah, it's very much a book with pets in mind. My own cat is not here tonight. there is a real environmental footprint, and it's not just a carbon footprint. With cats, it's the predation of birds and other animals. So there is no, and I think with dogs as well. I mean, dogs, when they go roaming in wild spaces or in parks, they make it difficult for other animals to live in those spaces, and for those spaces to be really rich in biodiversity. Now, I think the important thing is not to exaggerate it. I mean, the footprint of our cats and dogs is not as big in any way as the footprint that we have if we are meat eaters. And I think that statistic that you quote about what percentage of the biomass of mammals are in fact humans and livestock, you can look up, and their pets are too small to show on that chart on a global level. So obviously, in countries like this, there is a footprint. What I would say is that, so what I try and say in the book is, use it as a springboard. Use our love for pets to make us think about the impact we can have on the world. So we know that personally, and we know that through our pets we have a carbon footprint, and we use a certain amount of land. But we see in our dogs and cats an emotion, a power, something that we relate to, a continuity with our own species. So let's use that to remind ourselves why we should be taking care of animals on farms, and why we should be protecting wild animals. And if we can tolerate a million or two more dogs over lockdown in this country, like, surely we have space for some wolves in Scotland. Or if you value one species so much, can we not also make more effort to protect the million species of animals who are at risk of extinction? Yeah, so I think it's counterproductive to say to people, give up your pet dog or cat, because I think that's it's like wrenching a child from them. But I think you can get people to use it as a springboard.
Good point. Next question, is eating organic food a step in the right direction? What's your view of organic food? I think particularly meat, probably in this context of this conversation, in relation to animal welfare.
Oh, in animal welfare terms, organic food will tend to be better. I mean, there isn't it's the best labeling system that we have for milk, for example. We don't have although some people produce cheese where the cows and the calves are kept together and there is a sort of family unit, that's not labeled. So organic is probably the best there is, and it does guarantee an access to the outdoors for at least some of the year. It doesn't guarantee anything about separation between cow and calf. So I think organic food does have welfare benefits. I think the problem we have in the West is that on many issues there's a trade-off between increasing welfare and also increasing environmental footprint. So if you give animals the space to roam around, then you need more land, and if you have slower growing breeds of cow or chicken, then they will grow slower over more time, so they'll need more food to input, so they'll be less efficient as a source of meat. So there are those trade-offs, and that's why I think, fundamentally the big idea is eat less. I think organic agriculture, for me, there are questions about whether the big question we have at a global scale is land. As Mark Twain said, buy land, they're not making more of it, or they're not making it anymore, to quote him, right? And I think fundamentally we do need to farm the smallest area possible, and organic is one way of doing that. But I speak to regenerative farmers who do use some pesticides, and they say, look, we're not, organic isn't quite the answer, but something close to it that involves less tillage of the soil and less using of fertilizer and pesticides, but not zero is the answer. So I'm open to it, but I don't think it's I think sometimes it's more complicated than that.
We live right next to the Knepp Estate, which is probably knows the biggest rewilding project, I think, in Western Europe at the moment, certainly one of the biggest. And we've got a question here. What is your view about eating meat from animals that are part of a rewilding project, such as a NEP estate. It sort of links in what you were saying there.
Yeah, I know some people call net wild farming instead of rewilding, but I think so I use the example. So I use two examples in the book. One is wild venison. So deer where there is a environmental reason to limit the number of deer, because you're choosing between deer and other species. If you allow deer to browse everything, other species suffer. And you're hopefully killing that deer with a shot to his or her heart, and there's an immediate death. And I think I'm comfortable with that. And I'm also comfortable eating rope-grown mussels, because there's very limited it seems very unlikely that mussels can feel pain. And growing them on ropes, and they are filter feeders, so they clean the water, is an environmentally sustainable way. To add to that, I think some of the animals kept on sort of wild farming projects are probably pretty close to that. And I certainly think that's not the immediate, if people want to hang on to some meat, then please let it be the meat from NEP and other places like it, but just to eat much less of it. And I think, I guess what I would add, just as one small point, is that people sometimes say, I eat good meat. But it's actually, when you think about the meat you eat, what's interesting is how little of it is within your control. So even if you buy NEP estate meat, you'll notice that it's either sold out when you go there, or you'll have that once a week. And the other 6 times you have meat, you'll have no idea where that meat comes from, because it's in a sandwich at a shop or at a friend's house or at work. And so I think it's just being conscious about how much meat we eat, which isn't in our control, and also how much we need to cut down by. The Committee on Climate Change, the National Food Strategy by Henry Dimbleby recommends a 30% cut in meat eating by 2030. So that would be equivalent to everybody giving up meat for 2 or 3 days a week. So it's not just one meal, it's 2 or 3 days a week. And to be honest, not everyone's going to do it. So if you're someone who's concerned about climate change, you probably need to do a bit more than the average. So maybe 4 or 5 days a week. So, it's a chunk that's going, not just 1 day a week.
No, definitely. Now, we've talked a lot about the land, but of course, most of our planet is ocean. And a lot of people watch the recent Netflix movie, Seaspiracy. And I know you talk about fish quite a bit in the book. Perhaps you could just tell us what your views are on that and where we should be going.
Yeah, I thought Seaspiracy was it brought together the two pieces. One is animal welfare, that these are animals that I read a Jeremy Paxman book as in sort of research for my book, which sort of dismissed out of hand the idea that fish could feel pain, but there is good evidence now that fish can feel pain. And our bodies are much more similar to those of fish than we understand. Than we might have thought. I mean, we share an evolutionary history. So I think it got that right, and I think it got the problems around overfishing right. In my book, I come to the conclusion that we should eat less fish, and we should not tolerate such suffering. I think animal welfare laws in the UK say, you can't do this, and this to an animal, except if it happens in the normal course of fishing. So to basically say that fishing is kind of excluded. And I think we should look for ways of humane slaughter, just as we've developed for livestock. We should have that for fish. And I think fish farms in particular are places where there are real welfare issues around lice on salmon, and on the type of lives they live. But I think realistically, if we were to stop all fishing, then we would need more space on land to farm. And I think that it makes sense to take for countries which, particularly those countries which are very reliant on fish as a source of protein. I think of in Africa and Asia and parts of Latin America, that they should have first call on the ocean. But I fundamentally think that Seaspiracy was a force for good and raised issues, even if it got a few of the facts wrong. I think you ask about amazing statistics. I mean, one of the ones that's in my book, and I think may have been mentioned as Conspiracy as well, is just how much plastic waste in the ocean is discarded fishing nets. I think they use the statistic of nearly half the Great Garbage Patch is discarded fishing nets and equipment. I mean, that's completely astonishing. You think of a fish, you don't think of all the equipment that's being used. And of course, fishing nets become entangled, so they get cut off. The fishermen who live a hard life just give up on it, and I think that's really shocking.
You worked in an abattoir. You've done your research. Is there something that we need to be doing which goes beyond reading books or just having the knowledge or knowing the facts that's going to actually give us that sort of experiential, that emotional connection to nature that we need in order to make the changes that you're endorsing?
That's really interesting. I mean, it's called How to Love Animals because I think people describe themselves as animal lovers, as I mentioned earlier. And I found this brilliant clip of a Fox News anchor called Tucker Carlson, who's basically racist. So is not a lovable character. But he was debating with a vegan activist, and the only way he could argue with this activist was to say, "Well, I love animals," and so and I feel bad about factory farming too. And so I thought it was really interesting that there's nobody who wants to seem like they don't care about animals. That's why politicians adopt puppies. So my book is aimed at people with an emotional connection with animals. Having said that, there are people who have done huge amounts for animals who don't have any emotional connection to them. And Peter Singer, the philosopher, doesn't like animals, doesn't keep pets, but just doesn't think they should be discarded in the way that they are, and doesn't think they should be treated in the way that they are on a sort of almost intellectual level. And so if you don't have that connection to animals, where you just care very much about climate change, or for example, I think that's absolutely fine. Having said that, I really value the connection with nature. And there's a fantastic book called Losing Eden by Lucy Jones, just talking about how much nature did for her. And she had mental health issues, but how much being in contact with it. And she goes through and thinks about the contact with the soil and what the microbes might be and what the evolutionary history might be. One thing, my book talks a bit about zoos, and it talks about my childhood experience with zoos, and then questions some of the claims that zoos make about educating us about animals. And I've decided not to take my children regularly to zoos. They have been, but one of the things I find that they really appreciate is just looking in our pond. We have a tiny pond in our garden, and we're lucky enough to have frogs. And just seeing the tadpoles and then seeing the froglets and the frogs is like as much of a joy as I think I ever got at the zoo, because you're seeing animals in their natural environment, you're seeing them close up, you're seeing animals who, you see a giraffe at London Zoo, the giraffe isn't doing anything because it's not in their natural environment. And so I really value those closeness which people might get for going from a walk, or for putting out bird food, or putting out pollinating plants in their garden. I mean, not spraying pesticides is a great start. So all of those things I think help. And like you could go through 1,000 individual actions which would make a difference. And I have some at the back of the book. But I would just say whatever works for you, and just feel confident that your change does infect others. It does inspire others.
And as we come to a close, towards the end of or very much the end of your book, you say deliberate domestication is a dead end. Wildness is a path that takes us where we need to go, which is a very interesting, very powerful statement. Perhaps you could just elaborate on that, and any other closing thoughts you'd like to give us, Henry.
Yeah, I think so. When you think about the pig breeding farm I worked on was a pretty good one. Run by a good farmer, and it brought me to lots of questions about what is a good life. What does it mean? Is it okay if one day a bolt goes in your head and you know nothing about it? Well, is that a good life? Does that affect your well-being? And so lots of philosophical questions. But I think lockdown, watching the farm and also lockdown clarified for me that what what matters about life is the freedom to take your own decisions, and the freedom to have some kind of control over your life. And that's what animals on farms so often lack. They're impregnated, they're kept within a particular facility, they're not allowed to choose their own food. And I think we would find that life intolerable. And once we realize that we share many emotional and social sort of needs with other mammals and other animals in general, then we would understand why farming is a bad thing. I think our domestication of animals, both pets and farm animals, has led to real distortions. We've made animals into sizes where they can't, in the case of chickens, support their own bodies. In the case of some flat-faced dogs, like French bulldogs, they can't close their eyes because of the way we've bred them. And I think that is just fundamentally unhealthy, and it's misunderstands our relationship with wild animals to be looking to alter them all the time and to play God in this way. I think what we should appreciate is wild animals taking decisions over their own lives, and that will have an environmental benefit as well as a welfare benefit. That very many of the things we need to do to protect animal welfare are also the things we need to do to protect biodiversity and to fight against climate change. And that's why I think the case is so overwhelming. And I how do you make this case? Well, I think by living by living the message you want to sort of spread. So that's why I believe individual action rather than lecturing people. It's sort of about changing your behavior and try to show that it's a happy, normal life living without eating animal products and trying to minimize one's footprint on the natural world.
No, very good point. We just had one final question just sneak in. Perhaps you could just close with this. Don't you feel that zoos have changed a lot and many are breeding to help save some animals that are disappearing and at risk of going extinct?
Dottie, I see your question. Thank you. Yes, they have changed a huge amount. But I think they are still fundamentally the same institutions. And London Zoo is on the same site that it was, and it was created as a sort of at a time of empire, but also of scientific curiosity to show things that we'd never seen before. And we don't need that anymore because we've seen giraffes on TV, so we don't need a giraffe brought to us in the centre of London. I think fundamentally they can't meet the needs. For example, giraffes and elephants in the wild, they like forming their own herds, and they like coming and going. Some members of that herd will come and go. A male giraffe will wander off and then come back into the group. In a zoo, they're just locked up in a small space with animals they haven't chosen. And so we would find that intolerable if we were told, these are your flatmates and you can't move out. Although if you do fall in love with one of your flatmates, one day we might just rip them out and send them to another zoo. Are they breeding animals to say that they're disappearing? The large animals, which I think the welfare issues are most acute with, no. And zoos have been involved in a surprisingly small percentage of successful reintroductions to the wild. Generally, because they've been in captivity for so long, they often forget the behaviors that they need for the wild, and they're bred out of they're bred in ways that are not conducive to being released. And so they're used to they become very tame to people, for example, which may not be a good survival strategy. So the way to stop animals disappearing is really to protect their habitat. And so zoos are good really when they're investing in saving wild species. And there are type, with amphibians is an area where 40% of amphibians are threatened with extinction. They're really easy to breed in zoos, and they can be released into the wild, and they won't suffer welfare problems in zoos to the same extent as elephants will. So let's focus zoos on those small animals and not teach our kids that they should expect to see giraffes in the centre of London, because it's not the right climate, there's not enough space, and they can't choose their groups.
Brilliant. Henry, that was wonderful. Thank you ever so much. That was, it's a brilliant talk. I thoroughly recommend the book. And I'll just move my head out of the way so that our next green books. We've got 2 or 3 authors we're talking to. We had one person pull out, unfortunately, but our next talk on Thursday, November the 4th, same time, will be on the same subject in many ways, about vegan cookery. So how to cook vegan food. So we'll be doing it as a special with Fairer World, friends at Fairer World Linfield as well. And as always, sign up for our newsletter. We've got a lot of events. We've got a lot of very exciting developments, new projects to do with biodiversity, to do with transport, to do with energy, to do with lifestyle, to do with cooking. There's a place for everybody. So tell your friends about it and join us at Greening Stenning. And again, Henry, thank you very much. That was wonderful. Thank you.
It was a pleasure. Have a great evening, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.